There's a little graph that lives in your camera that most beginners maybe have seen but didn't really know what it did, and they kind of ignore it. But once you understand it, it's going to open your eyes to be able to really understand exposure and how to get your images to be exposed properly. It's called a histogram. And today I'm going to show you how to read a histogram, what it means, and how to get the proper usages out of it. Hi, I'm Ryan Huffman, the photo professor, and let's get into it. So what is a histogram? Well, a histogram is very simply a graph that is showing you all of the tone levels of an image. So what does that mean? Well, if let's say we took a shot of a completely black room, right? There's no light in it whatsoever, it's just pure darkness. Well then on a histogram, we're going to see that there's really no information, it's just going to spike in the area of the shadows. So a histogram is going to show you everything from the deepest, darkest shadows to the brightest highlights, okay? So if you took an image in bright outdoor sun and it was completely overexposed, purely white, then the histogram would be spiked all the way over to the highlight side, where there's no information except just like all the way over to the highlights. Now, let's say that we took a shot, in theory, that was perfect middle gray, like a 50% middle gray of something. Then right in the middle of the histogram is where we would see a spike. Obviously, the things that we're shooting on a daily basis are not pure black, pure white, or pure gray, right? They're falling all sorts of tones in between. And so what a histogram can tell us is where do the majority of the tones lie, right? If the histogram is pushed way over towards the highlights, then that means the majority of the image is relatively bright. If they're pushed all the way over towards the shadows, then that means the majority of the image is dark. Now, does that mean that the image is underexposed or overexposed? That's a little more complicated. That doesn't necessarily mean, even if most of the tones are in the darker shadow area, that doesn't mean the entire image is underexposed. It could just mean that the majority of the tones in the scene are just towards that shadow area. You could still have proper exposure under that situation. Same thing with the tones pushed to the highlight side. So what are we looking for in a histogram? Well, first of all, how do you even read a histogram? As we're looking at a histogram here in Photoshop, this image here in the background, we're going to look down here to the far left. In Photoshop, it's really easy to tell because you can see there's a gradient over here that goes from black up to white, black out to white. So down here in the corner to the far left, this is where your dark shadows and blacks are going to be. So, you know, like an area like this right here, or this, that's all going to fall into this area. And then over to the far right, you can see that's where the white area is, and up here up top. So if we had an area, so you can see these skies are obviously exposed properly, because if not, if they were pure white, we would have a huge spike going all the way up here, but we don't. It just comes up just a little bit there. So your whites are over here, and then right here in the middle is basically everything from kind of here to here. These are all just kind of mid-tones, meaning that, you know, right around here, it's not like super dark, but it's starting to get a little bit brighter, and it's not super bright here. It's starting to get a little bit darker, and everything just kind of falls into a midpoint right around there. The vertical part of the axis is going to show you how many pixels reside in that certain area. So whenever you see a peak, whenever you see the histogram go all the way up to the top, that's where the majority of the pixels are. So if you see a peak all the way over to the left, then that means that the majority of the image is in shadow or blackness, meaning that the majority of the image might be underexposed. Same thing if you saw a peak all the way over to the right where the highlights are, then the majority of the image might be overexposed. There's too much brightness going on in the scene. When you're taking a look at the horizontal axis, we're just going from black to white, and then the vertical axis is the pixel density. How many pixels are in that certain area? So when you see, a lull, a valley in a certain area, that means there's not too much information, if any information at all, in that one area. There is not a correct or a perfect histogram shape, okay? It's not like an S-curve. That is a misconception, that you want it to be perfectly in the middle. Some people think that they want it to be perfectly in the middle because that means, well, it's not super overexposed or underexposed. Either way, it's kind of perfect in the middle. That doesn't really matter because each scene is very different. So in like this scene right now with me, because I'm wearing a dark colored shirt, obviously this part of the histogram would be pushed over towards the shadows. Now, does that mean that it's underexposed? No, right? It's just because I'm wearing a dark shirt. But there's bright areas back behind me that are obviously going to have some pixels pushed way over into the highlight area. And so because this entire scene has some areas that are very, very dark and some that are really bright, and then some that are kind of in between, like my face and my hands, etc., you're going to see the histogram kind of all over the place. That's okay. What you really want to be looking for is, do I have an extreme spike, to the left or the right? That's going to alert me that I have a really bright area that might be too far overexposed, or a really dark area that might be too far underexposed. I don't necessarily just want to look at it and freak out if it's not right in the middle, or even if I have spikes to the sides. Sometimes that's okay, because for instance, right now, wherever these pixels are showing up on the histogram, those are going to be spiked all the way in the bright area, in the white highlight area. I know that that's going to happen though, because I have some areas that are kind of pure bright in this scene. So I'm not going to let that freak me out when I look at the histogram. You might think, okay, well, I took the picture and I looked at it on my LCD screen and it looked okay. So can't I just judge that? Can't I just take that and judge it with my eyes and think, okay, this looks correct? Your LCD screen has its own brightness settings, and it's giving you a representation of what the image looks like, but it's not always perfectly accurate. And I know that gives you a little bit of anxiety maybe. What I mean by that is there could be areas on your LCD screen that look like they're properly exposed, but that is more of a reliance upon the way your LCD screen is calibrated. Then you bring the image into, image editing software, and all of a sudden it looks a little different. Well, that's why we need to judge using the histogram, because the histogram, if we look at the LCD screen and it looks like everything is exposed properly, but the histogram says, hey, look, there's a huge spike over here in the highlights. It's like, oh, well, maybe I should back my exposure off just a little bit to make sure I don't massively overexpose that certain area. Even though on the LCD screen, it didn't look like I necessarily massively overexposed that area, the histogram is telling me something different. So I better go ahead and make that change, because here's the important thing. If you have an area of your image that is completely over or underexposed, meaning that an overexposure completely would be an area where the highlights are blown out, which means that there's no information there whatsoever. It's so bright that there's no pixel information there. So if you were to print that, on just a piece of paper, no ink would go down in that area because it's just pure white. It would just let the paper print right there. And the problem with that is that you can't edit those pixels at all, because there really are no pixels there. There's no information there whatsoever. The same thing in a black area. You've underexposed it so much that it's a pure black, and so there's no information there either. So you can't really edit anything there. There's no way to edit it because there's no real information there. So in order to avoid that, we need to use the histogram to make sure that we're not massively under or overexposing something. Now again, creatively, you might want to under or overexpose something on purpose. Totally fine. But for the most part, on everyday shooting, we don't really want, think about this for an example. You're taking portraits of someone and their skin tone looks really good. It looks like you're getting exposure nailed, but off the cheek or the nose or the forehead, these areas that protrude and catch a lot of light, there could be a highlight there that is totally overexposed. And then when you go try and edit it later on, there's no information there, so they have just a really bright white spot there that you cannot get rid of. Now you could try to clone stamp it, etc. We won't get into that, but the point being that if you would have underexposed a little bit, yeah, maybe the rest of the skin might have been a little dark, but you could fix that. At least those areas that were completely gone actually have information there now, and you can edit them a little bit. Another thing when looking at a histogram is if you look at one that has the tones pushed more towards the highlights or more towards the shadows, that could mean that it's over or underexposed. You know, if the entire histogram is pushed more towards the highlights, maybe the image is overexposed. But again, what you're really looking for is the clipping. Clipping means whenever something gets all the way to a pure white or a pure black, and that's what we really want to avoid. Again, I've already talked about this, but basically you just want to watch out that you don't have areas that are totally pure white or pure black because there's no information there. That's called clipping. Highlights, we could say that they are blown out. So if you hear someone say, oh, your highlights are blown out, that means there's no information there. This happens really often in the sky when we take images that have a sky in them and something else on the foreground. Maybe you could see clouds when you actually shot it with your eyes, but when you take the shot and you look at it on your monitor, the clouds are gone because you overexposed it, so there's no detail there. So you have clipped or blown out the highlights in that area. And then with shadows, we can say we crushed the shadows, or that they're very muddy, and that there's ways to refer to it, but basically we mean that the shadows are completely black. There's no information there whatsoever. So that's just a little terminology. If you hear people say that, that's what that means. You can also obviously look at the histogram in post-processing. If you're using Lightroom, Photoshop, any photo editing application, you can probably pull up a histogram to be able to look at it. And then as you adjust the image, it will adjust the histogram based off of that. Now, remember, you typically want to shoot raw if you know that you're going to be making a lot of edits to the tonality of the image. And the best way to edit tonality is to use curves. Again, whatever image editing program you're using, curves is where you can actually edit precise pixel depth information. If you're using things like brightness or contrast, those are global transformations. They're going to change a bunch of pixels at once, but with curves you can change just smaller areas of pixels, and that's going to be much more accurate to be able to remap things a little bit with your histogram. But just kind of get used to popping your histogram up on your camera. Most cameras have like an info button or something like that. If you push that, it'll pop up a histogram and you can see it as you're shooting. And if you use your histogram more often, you can kind of ensure that you're going to get better exposed images overall. Thanks for watching.